Hello and welcome back. Today we're looking at the third and final of our little mini series of Norfolk English whiskies today. It's not really got a catchy name. It's this one. So it's an English whisky from the English Whisky Company in Norfolk, branded as the English. It's a single malt whisky and it's peated. This is a current release. It's released in 2022 and it's still for sale. It's one of their small batch releases and they're calling it heavily smoked and also giving it the moniker Vintage 2010. So I think I'm going to refer to this one as heavily smoked. That seems to be as sensible name as any for what this is. And there have been a lot of other peated and heavily peated releases from the English Whisky Company in the past. In the early days you had Chapter 9, which was half peated and was very, very good. You had Chapter 11, which was 5 years old, 3 years old and peated, I think. And then Chapter 15 was 5 years old and peated. There's also been English Whisky Company Smoky Oak, which was like bourbon matured and heavily peated. That was very, very good. In my opinion, it's kind of a Laphroaig style peat, especially in that Smoky Oak release. Getting lots of bourbon sweetness from the casks and that heavily peated malt really is a Laphroaig type experience. So I guess in a way this one here is a continuation on that theme, getting older and older as the releases go along. I can't remember how old the Smoky Oak was, but that one was about 50-55 pounds for a non-chill filtered natural colour, 46% bottling. This one is surprisingly old. It's also natural colour and non-chill filtered, although they don't guarantee it on the label. You know how annoyed I am about that, but never mind. 46%, but this one is 12 years old. And 12-year-old whiskey doesn't seem like that much to sing and dance about, but I think it's amazing that the English Whisky Company, who have only been there since 2006, are now making 12-year-old whiskey. It's an amazing milestone for a company to sell 12-year-old whiskey and not even bother to use it as a selling point anymore. Small batch release as always. This is my bottle, my one bottle out of a batch of 2,850. We're also told that this is peated to 52 ppm, although that 52 ppm is the phenol count in the malt, not in the finished product. So basically it's the slightly meaningless way that they measure phenol count, the same as everyone else does. So it doesn't necessarily mean that much. Technically, on paper, this should be peatier than pretty much any of the standard releases from any of the Islay distilleries. But as we all know, just because you've got a high level of phenols in the malt before it's distilled doesn't mean that peaty, smoky flavour is going to carry through to the finished spirit. Interestingly, when I was last at the English Whisky Company, I was told by the tour guide that the peated malt that they use is sourced from Islay, as opposed to the unpeated malt that they use here in Norfolk, which is sourced from Crisps in Fakenham. So we are relying on that Islay peated malt for the peated releases from the English Whisky Company, possibly because here in Norfolk we burnt all of our peat many years ago. Possibly because we burnt all of our peat here in Norfolk hundreds of years ago. Interesting to know that peated malt's coming from Islay though, and because of that I'd assume that it's almost certainly Port Ellen malt. So pretty much standard presentation. It's what we've come to expect from the English Whisky Company small batch releases. Very attractive box, gold details, little picture of the distillery on the front. The English. I like the presentation coming out of Norfolk now. It's much more professional and cleaner, and I like these as well, but the current presentation is better. It's a lot better. And as always, you get one of these fantastic chunky glass decanter style bottles. Nice big cork stopper. All the details on the label: 2,850 bottles, 52 ppm. Date filled March 2010, bottled in August 2022, so 12 years and a bit. So let's get some in the glass, see what we've got. If anyone's after a decanter or infinity bottle, these are just such lovely bottles. So a little bit of added value there. So English Whisky Company, 12 years old if you do the maths from the label, heavily smoked on the nose. Now it's not the defining flavour or the main flavour on this one at all, but I always really liked it with this one. When I keep going back to it, I'm always surprised there's a pleasant, oily greasiness to the nose on this one. But saying that, it is a light and refined peated whiskey. It's definitely not a young and feisty peat bomb of a whiskey. It's actually very fruity on the nose, lots of sweetness, sweet wood smoke. There's also a surprising sugariness coming through from the barley on this one. Kind of along the lines of fire-damaged sugar mice. That can be my flowery, ridiculous tasting note for the month there. Jeff Whisky can use that in one of his videos of ridiculous tasting notes. Fire-damaged sugar mice. I'd actually say that that sugary note coming through is kind of on par with that sugary note that I get from the Loch Lomond peated single grain. Obviously grain whiskey quite often has a distinct crystalline sugary note. It's kind of on par with that refined sugary quality. Very, very mature though. A little bit of light lime citrus on the nose, as well as some medicinal antiseptic bandage quality. Pleasant oakiness, lovely. Obviously I'm not tasting it yet, but that sort of dense chewy oakiness that you get on some whiskies, as well as that pleasant greasiness to the malt. Let's see how it tastes. A little bit darker than the rum cask release, I think, but then it is about twice the age, so you'd probably expect it to be a little bit darker. But interesting to know, that is a natural colour 12-year-old English whiskey, and that extra colour is obviously not coming through from the peat, because if you're using peated or unpeated malt, it all comes off the still clear the same. So that extra colour is coming through from the extra time that is spent in the cask, and possibly some different casks. Flavours on the palate, I'm getting lots of sour peatiness. Definitely, it's not a peat bomb, but there's a decent amount of smoke to this. Lots of smokiness, wood smoke, and a lovely warming peat smoke quality. There's a nice sour fruitiness on the palate of this one as well. Kind of like sweetened lime, a distinct saltiness on the palate, and the kind of thing that we might describe as a maritime quality in something like a Laphroaig or possibly a Talisker. Norfolk has a huge amount of coastline, but like I've said before, the English Whisky Distillery in Rowdham is about as far away as you can get from the sea without leaving Norfolk. So I don't think we can argue that that maritime quality is coming through from the sea, but there's definitely a saltiness on the palate of this one. And more of that lovely, dense, chewy, smoky oak, which is something that really reminds me of that dense, chewy oakiness along with the peat. It really reminds me of the Laphroaig 10-year-old cask strength. Also getting some mild, orangey malt notes. I'm actually quite pleased that this whiskey is not overly bourbonised or vanilla-led, which kind of makes for a refreshing change, especially when you compare this. I think the closest thing to this on Islay is going to be some sort of Laphroaig. And when you think about how sweet and bourbon-led and vanilla-led a lot of Laphroaig is, it's really refreshing that this one is more about that refined peat and the fruitiness in particular. It's a very mature, and very refined flavour profile. And in particular, as I mentioned before, I really like that greasy, oily, peated malty note that you get on the nose and the palate of this one. Really reminds me of the kind of oily, greasy, peated malty flavour profile that you get on some sort of mid to high teen Islay whiskies. Absolutely 100% not a young, feisty peat bomb though. As for the finish, I'm going to say medium long, so very good on that front, with lots of notes of peated grist. When it comes to forming a verdict on this one though, I can't help thinking that it's definitely not as peaty as some of the earlier batches from the English Whisky Company, in particular things like the Chapter 11, which was 3 years old, and the Chapter 15, which is 5 years old. But then that's probably because this is over twice the age of some of those releases, or in the case of Chapter 11, 4 times the age of that release. I would say though that it's even gentle in terms of the peatiness and the flavour profile compared to other 12-year-old peated whiskies. I think it feels a little bit like it's old before its time, but in exchange for that lack of raw peaty power, it has a lovely fruitiness among the peat that we don't often get anymore from many of the Islay distilleries. I think that the fruitiness and the complexity that you get on this one, it's really something that we probably used to get more of in the past with Islay distilleries, whereas these days, perhaps the average Islay distillery is a little bit more rushed in their production than they used to be. If I was going to compare this to any Islay whiskey, I'd say that it's probably closest to a cross between a young Kalila and a Laphroaig, but probably a little bit lighter and more refined than either. And I do wonder if that's at least partly down to that accelerated maturation you get from the casks of this sitting in that slightly warmer, temperate English climate. If you do the tour at the English Whisky Company, which I recommend you do, they do make a big point about how the English climate being warmer leads to the whisky maturing faster than it does in Scotland, and that's not really something that I buy into. I think that with smaller casks and warmer climates, it doesn't mature a whisky faster, but it leads to an accelerated cask effect on the whisky, which is not really entirely the same thing. But with this one, I do wonder if that warmer climate has led to this aging or appearing to age a little bit faster. Because it must be said that it does seem older than 12 years old. I'd probably compare this more directly to something like a 15 or 16-year-old Laphroaig. That lighter and fruitier flavour profile though, it has had me thinking about this one. In particular about the way that there's a lot of notes in this that kind of seem reminiscent of the kind of whiskey that we got from Islay sort of 15, 20 years ago. That lighter, more refined, fruitier, slightly more complex, but especially fruitier flavour profile that we got from our peated Islay whiskey decades ago. And I do wonder if part of that might be from the slightly longer fermentation time that they do at the English Whisky Company. They actually only ferment twice a week at the English Whisky Company, 2 batches, 3.5 days each. And I do think that the flavours, and in particular the fruitiness that you get coming through on this one, probably do show that. The peat though, the peat in isolation, if you ignore that fruity maltiness, it is interesting that I do think that the peaty notes and the flavours in the peat are quite Islay. And in particular, I think that dense, chewy oakiness is really quite Laphroaig. Probably not a coincidence, if it's true what I was told by that tour guide, that the peated malt for this is coming from Islay. And the English Whisky Company had Ian Henderson, who used to work at Laphroaig, come down and act as a consultant when they were setting the distillery up. And even the stills in the still house at the English Whisky Company must be said that they are a little bit Laphroaig-y. So as for a grade on this one, when I first tried it, I'm not going to lie, I was a little bit disappointed at the lack of power, but when you really get to know it and you really get into it, you realise that there's a lot more going on here than just a dumb peat bomb. And in particular, I was really pleasantly surprised by the advanced maturity and complexity. So while on the one hand, I was slightly disappointed with this, on the other hand, I also like it more than I expected to, if that makes sense. It doesn't make sense at all. Basically, I like this a lot, but in a different way to what I expected to. So as for a grade, I think it can only be a solid B. So that's bang in the middle of what I would call very good. One last little bit of trivia on this one and the English Whisky Company. When I was there last time, I learned that they actually use different cut points on their spirit when they're running their stills, depending on whether it's an unpeated or a peated batch of whiskey they're making. So if they're doing a peated run of whiskey, they'll actually cut further into the faints to give the spirit more character and more body and make it a bit more bolder so it stands up to that peat. But saying that, I still think that this whiskey is a very refined, elegant, mature whiskey. It's very well made, and I think in a way it's kind of a thinking man's peated whiskey. Let me know what you think of English whiskey, and in particular peated English whiskey. Thanks for watching, and cheers.